I have never done a video like this before, but these datamine cards are too insane for me to not take a look at. Let's take a look at the Venomverse datamines. First up is Agent Venom, who appears to be the season pass card of this season, which I believe is slated to come out in November in Marvel Snap. Agent Venom is a 2/4 with an on-reveal ability that sets the cost of all the cards in your deck to 4. And at face value, this looks like a very powerful thing to be doing with some basically already strong cards. An example to me would be something along the lines of, Iron Man, but you don't necessarily have to get full value out of this card in order for it to still be a reasonable card. For example, when you think about the Athena Darkhawk package, a lot of the cards in that package are going to have less than 4 power, meaning that you're going to be able to get a lot of value out of doing things like, 4 power Mystique. We mentioned 4 power Iron Man already, but even, 4 power Darkhawk is a 1 power buff, 4 power Rock Slide is a 1 power buff, 4 power Athena means it'll be like 7 if you play it on the last turn of the game. That's pretty useful. 4 power Angela is a little bit of a buff. 4 power Kitty Pryde is a little bit of a buff. It actually seems like the kind of card that people are going to try to build around, and you can build around it. Like, for example, this could be the core to a Cerebro 4 deck, which actually seems fairly unique and interesting as far as Cerebro decks go. But also, I think just this stat line is enough for people to sit up and take notice, because 2/4 with an ability that you might actually want is actually an unprecedented stat line in Marvel Snap. The 2/4s in the game are things like Cloak, which are symmetrical, and your job is to make it so that you get more value out of them than your opponent does, but your opponent can still do things with those cards. This is a 2/4 that's just a 2/4, and I'm interested to see about what exactly this can do just being a 2/4 in a deck full of other good cards. We've seen what being a 3/5 with upside can do for a 3-cost card. A 2/4, in my estimation, is better relative to the other things at its energy cost than a 3/5 is. So it's really going to come down to how strong this ability ends up being and what we can do to really build around it. Other cards that strike me as useful to play in a deck like this are cards like Brood. So obviously, for example, a 3/4 Brood seems pretty powerful to get off while you can. Brood decks tend to also run cards like Patriot, Mystique, Iron Man. There could be an Iron Patriot Anti-Venom deck in the future here. Another thing that comes to mind is potentially Zoo, but the issue with running this in Zoo means you might lose out on things like the ability to run a profitable Shadow King if so many of your cards are getting buffed, the ability to run Gilgamesh, and the ability to run Mockingbird. Maybe you can make up for those losses by running things like, Shang-Chi and Iron Man and Mystique. I think that's entirely possible in a deck that is able to turn things that have 0 power into 4 power. One thing that does strike me about this is I wonder if it will be you build around this or if this is a package that goes in other decks. Because part of me looks at this and says, what if we just put Anti-Venom, Iron Man, Mystique? Sorry, that's Agent Venom. They did a thing this season where they're releasing a card called Agent Venom in the same season as they're releasing a card called Anti-Venom. I'll get to that later. It's gonna be confusing, you can tell because I'm already confused. This is Agent Venom, who might be a package with Iron Man Mystique in various decks. That seems like the most likely outcome of this card to me, is that it ends up being one of those modular packages that we switch in and out, rather than something that we fully super invest in. You run Agent Venom in a deck where there's no bad hits, and then when you're running Agent Venom, you also run Iron Man Mystique, because 4 power Iron Man and Mystique copying that is very, very strong. So in terms of where I can see this landing, I can see this landing as a modular package in Athena decks with that Iron Man package. I can see this landing as a modular package in Zoo decks with that Iron Man package. I can also see decks that are fully built around it. A Patriot deck would be more fully built around it. Of course, it would probably also run that Iron Man Mystique package, but it also has the ability to be a Cerebro deck, which again, probably also runs that Iron Man Mystique package. So I do think that that is really the starting point when you're thinking about how to play with Agent Venom, is what decks can reasonably support this and not be sad about it. And the most you're going to get out of it usually is going to be ridiculous Iron Man Mystique stuff, which does seem pretty compelling to me. This looks like a very good way to put points on the board, and the question will be how well it meshes with the other dominant ways of putting points on the board at the time of release. Scream is a 2/1 with an ability that reads, whenever an enemy card moves, you steal 2 power from it. So steal 2 power to me, that's drain, right? It's draining the way Cassandra Nova does. My speculation is that this card will work in such a way as the card that moves loses 2 power and Scream gains 2 power. The interesting thing about this card for me is the once per turn, which implies that if this card were uncapped, it would probably be a little bit broken. Keep in mind that these cards are datamined to release in November, I believe. I believe. But whatever it is, they're coming out the season after Aranya and Madam Web, who I might have to go back and cover because, like I said, I've never done a video like this before. I'm dipping my feet into doing videos like this. It's possible I'll end up having to cover them as well, but the TLDR on them is they should make move as a strategy very strong, and this card seems like a reasonable way to deal with move as a strategy, which is quite interesting. However, the cap on it means that it probably isn't actually a great way to deal with move as a strategy, because the way I would envision a Madam Web deck working is you're moving more than one thing per turn. Scream isn't going to be able to keep all of that in check. So what this card actually looks like to me, rather than a counter to move, this is Thena, except instead of asking you to play 2 cards, it's asking you to play Polaris and Stegron and Arrow and Spider-Man. And that is interesting to me because, like, again, scaling +4, which is effectively what this is doing, is quite strong. And this is a card that can get +4 effectively for doing what it asks of you, which is playing, Arrow, Magneto, things of that nature. It'll do that, right? And so I kind of wonder if this is going to be enough to deal with a potentially dominant move deck. My instinct is it probably won't, right? Like, this looks like it's supposed to be an anti-move counter card, but instead it's going to be a build around mid-range 2-drop. This is Thena, this is Angela, this is a 2-drop that is saying I will get very big if you do the thing that I'm asking you to do. With Angela, that's play on my lane. With Thena, that's play 2 cards a turn. With Scream, that is play the cards that you have in your deck that move other cards in your opponent's deck. This is Thena for moving your opponent's cards. It is not, as far as I can tell, a card that is going to actually deal with move if it becomes a really good deck. I would say that this is actually something I would not worry about if you were a move gamer. The interesting thing to me then becomes, how does this actually work in terms of ordering? Let's say my opponent has a Human Torch and it is at 2 power and they move that Human Torch and I have a Scream face up on the board. Does that Human Torch go to 0 and stop doubling forever? Does that Human Torch go to 4 and then back down to 2? And then they move it again and it goes to 4 and then back down to 2? Either way, it does seem like if you're going to deal with someone moving a Human Torch once per turn, this is the best way you can deal with it. The issue is you probably are going to deal with someone moving a Human Torch more than once per turn, and once he starts scaling out of the range where this is meaningfully impacting it, I don't think that's necessarily going to do enough to keep it in check. I'm hopeful for this card because I am very scared of the move cards in the month before, but right now it does not read as a pure move counter to me. It's doing some splash damage to move, and then it is its own kind of archetype enabler rather than being an anti-move tech card. However, if they remove the cap, this card might actually just obliterate move forever. And I think that's probably why the cap is on there, because if they remove the cap, this is Human Torch is not a card. Dagger even is getting some meaningful hits. Like, this is a really, really meaningful counter to move, especially Human Torch, if it is not capped. And so I do think the fact that it is capped makes it more of a, like, oh, hopefully this will make me a little bit better into move, but really what I'm doing is playing Stegron and Arrow and Polaris and Spider-Man and maybe Kingpin or something, and that's my mid-range Thena core. Misery is kind of fascinating. An on-reveal card that repeats the abilities of the other on-reveal cards at the location you're at, but then destroys them. So it's like, it's Odin, but it eats them, which means it's, like, kind of hard to actually fit into a lot of stuff. Because at 5 versus at 6, like, it's not like it's that big of a difference between just playing this and playing Odin. When you look at how decks that are meaningfully playing Odin are actually playing out right now, a lot of what they do is either one of 2 things. The first kind of deck playing Odin you're going to see is going to be like a Wong deck. A Wong deck that is looking to fill up that lane, do something like Wong, Namora, Odin, or Wong, White Tiger, Odin, it doesn't really want to do that early. It wants to do that on time, and it doesn't really want to blow up the stuff in the lane that it's in. It wants to keep that power in that lane. Now, Misery is very interesting because there's one interaction that I'm not really sure about. How does this card work with armor? The way it's worded on the card, armor should not prevent this from working, which is interesting because when you look at something like, say, Arnim Zola, armor prevents Arnim Zola from doing that, again, because of the way it's worded, right? But this one says, repeat, then destroy. And that, I think, means that you will be able to do stuff with Misery and armor that would not necessarily be able to be done with Odin. You can get things done faster. Downsides are that it's very hard to play this, because the other kind of deck that really wants an effect like this is the Thor's deck, maybe with a Lockjaw or something like that. And there's so many on reveals in that deck that you don't want to be blowing up your own stats, right? You can't play this in a lane that Beta Ray Bill is in or that Thor is in because she will eat those cards. And that's a real limitation here. This is an exciting card, but fundamentally, what I think about Misery is that it's very exciting and looks very scary, but I don't actually know what you're supposed to do with this card. And maybe that'll just reveal itself to the world. Maybe it'll be fine. But to me, this reminds me of 4-3 Absorbing Man, 2-0 Grandmaster. Like, it's a card that comes out and everyone is excited for all the possibilities, but none of the possibilities are actually metagame competitive. They just end up being cool and not very good. And that's kind of my read on Misery right now. I look at this card and I see a card that is going to trick people into buying it. That's what I see when I see Misery. This is a card that looks scary, but isn't scary. And we'll have to see. Obviously, like, I'm talking about cards that are like 4 months away. There's some room for me to be wrong here, but right now, I look at Misery and that's what I see. Scorn is a 1/2. When you discard this, give +1 power to it and +1 power to something on your board, effectively is how this works. No, sorry, no, that's not how it works. Scorn is a 1/2. When you discard it, it gives power to one of your cards in play equal to Scorn's power, then comes back to your hand with additional power. And I think my question for this is this what discard needs? Or is there some other deck that is going to be able to meaningfully use this? Because one of the things that really strikes me about Scorn right now is this is a card that is adding a decent amount of power if you're able to get the train rolling early, but it also conflicts with your ability to do things like Swarm. So, for example, a lot of what you'd want to do with your Swarms is maybe get it started with a Colleen Wing and then keep it rolling and keep it rolling and keep it rolling. The question is doing Scorn stuff going to be better than that? And I really do wonder, because the interesting thing about Scorn is that it's kind of hard to get it out of your hand at the final turn of the game because of that additional 1 cost. It almost makes me wonder if the fact that Scorn comes out means that discard decks will want to start running more cards like Corvus Glaive. And I mean specifically Corvus Glaive, because in worlds where you aren't playing Dracula out, that Apocalypse that you've been building up the whole game is usually going to need to come down as part of your end game. And if you are not a Dracula gamer, that means that this Scorn that you've been building up over the whole course of the game is also going to need to come down. And one really great way of making that happen is Corvus Glaive, so you can play Apocalypse and the built-up Scorn. My instinct is that this card is somewhere in a sort of interstitial space where it's like it's not entirely Swarm and it's not entirely Apocalypse, and it's somewhere between them. And when you have a card like that, it's either going to be way better than those previous options or just clunky enough that it's not better than those previous options. And this is really interesting to me because one of my big things recently has been, I think Destroy needs help, I think Discard needs help. But when you actually get down to it and you give me a card that is Discard help, I look at it and I'm like, I'm not actually sure, I'm not sure this is better. I'm not sure this is solving the problems Discard has, because Discard's issue and Destroy's issue has always been that these are very linear point-based decks, and if your opponent can beat them on points, you're going to know. And they're going to be these very telegraphed and obvious final turns where it's like, okay, how many Swarms do they have? How big is the Apocalypse? How big is the Swarm? How big is the Scorn? And that's really the only thing you have to do. And so you end up setting up a situation where like a lot of these games are just your opponent kind of knows they're going to win or they're going to lose. And so you have poor cube equity. And the same goes for destroy, which is like, again, very telegraphed. Okay, we know how big the dead pool is. We know how big the null is. We know how cheap the death is. We know every possibility for what's about to happen on this final turn of the game. And I think that like this doesn't change that dynamic. So if a deck like that is ever to be the best deck again, a lot of that is going to be because of the necessity for something like, you know, a lot of power, right? The only way a deck like Destroy or Discard becomes the best deck again is if, you know, I guess Destroy could be like metagame things, like if Killmonger's really good. But Discard specifically, it needs to be like, this is the best way to do points right now. That is how Discard becomes good again. And I am not sure that Scorn is enough to make it the best way to do points right now. I'm just not sure how much it actually is an upgrade over what the deck already has, which is worrying to me. I don't really know exactly what this card wants to be. Again, it feels so halfway between Swarm and Apocalypse that I'm just not really sure how to look at it. But my worry is more for the archetype than anything else. One interesting thing is maybe this can go in like a Black Bolt Silver Samurai kind of deck where you're like small balling it, but you also get to like run actual tech cards, right? Like this card is a card, like there's so many like unique little pieces in discard. There's Proxima Midnight, there's this card that are good at getting tempo, but because of discard being a MODOK deck, you can't really run tech like Shang-Chi in order to catch up to the decks that are going taller than you, which is why discard has the problem of needing to be the thing that does the points the best, because if it doesn't do the points the best, it's going to lose out. And that is a problem that I like. This card could go in a deck that doesn't have that issue, that is able to run tech, that can do things like, you know, play a Colleen Wing for this and like have maybe a Swarm package or be like a, I don't know, you probably don't want to be a Moon Knight deck with Scorn in it. I don't really know. But like there's a disruptive world where you can do something like this in like a sort of maybe Dakin disrupt type deck, which I think is likely to end up, you know, behind the curve to things like Thena in terms of just how that curve is good, how that matchups are going to go. But I am interested in Scorn a little bit outside of traditional discard because I think traditional discard has a built-in ceiling on it that I really don't like. This card is straight up terrifying. So Toxin is a 3/2 bounce card. For every card that it bounces, meaning in the lane that you play it, it's going to get +2 power. So if you bounce 3 cards, this is a 3/8. Now, the reason this card is terrifying is not because of Toxin, but because of another bounce card, right? One of the strongest things current bounce decks can do is copy a beast with a Nico Minoru, making it so that you can run through multiple iterations of bouncing beast with beast, meaning you get to constantly repeat this energy discount and this incredible amount of repeatable power generation effects, like making a demon, like Rocket Raccoon, like even Sage in some cases. Now, this card will not discount anything, but it is also pretty damn big. In a world where you get to play this and bounce up a couple things that are 1-drops, right? And then on turn 4, you play those 1-drops out, you bounce up the whole thing with the beast, and then on turn 5, you play this guy back out again, and then you bounce up all the things with this, and suddenly you have this, it's 14 power, you've bounced your hood 3 times, you bounced your Rocket Raccoon 3 times. That seems really scary to me. Bouncing stuff multiple times. And granted, yes, this is probably worse than Beast. Beast is a 2/2 that gives you that energy discount. It's better to loop Beasts than it is to loop this. But even giving like a bad version of that to just be something you get to put in your deck is crazy. Because right now that's like a 1 in 10 games, 1 in 20 games high roll is being able to beast your beast. And you get to just sort of put that in your deck now. And that's a really scary thing. Like, I think that a card like this should necessitate a hard look at the bounce core and like what it is. How many more of these are you allowed to make is basically my take. I don't think you're allowed to make any more of these. I think once you've made Beast and once you've made this, you're done. You can't make anything else that does this in a way that is fun and unique and worth purchasing and also not broken. I think that even this might be pushing it because of just how ridiculous it is to constantly bounce your stuff, just how strong that ability is to have this repeatable energy, this repeatable engine of demons being created, and you're not really losing anything for it because you made a 14 power toxin in the process of generating 3 demons. Like, it's just very good. Like, this is just, when I look at this card, I'm like, oh, this is just very good. This is a ridiculously powerful, ridiculously good card that is going to make bounce ridiculously strong. I find it hard to believe that there is not something people are going to figure out to do with this card that is going to be very, very good. I think that at worst, this card ends up in the core of like a tier 2 deck. I have never been more sure about a prognostication 4 months out than this card is going to be good. I don't know exactly how good, but I feel like the floor on this card is so high. Like, it's just impossible that this doesn't become part of the bounce core. I find that incredibly hard to believe. I don't like making these videos because a lot of it is me going out on a limb and then I'm afraid someone's gonna clip it, right? The thing that keeps me from making these videos is fear of being wrong. But if I'm gonna make these videos, I have to say what I actually believe, and I think this card is crazy good. Anti-Venom. So first things first, for some berserk reason, Second Dinner decided it was a great idea to release a card called Agent Venom and a card called Anti-Venom in the same month. I have gotten them confused in the filming of this video, okay? There is a 1,000,000% chance no one is going to be able to keep these ones straight. Like, it's actually crazy. Agent Venom is the one that sets to 4. Anti-Venom is actually the coolest looking dude I've ever seen. Like, seriously, that art is awesome. What a cool thing to look like. Okay. This is a 4/6 that sets the next card you draw to 0 cost and 0 power. And I realize people are going to look at that and be like, what the hell is this actually trying to do? Do I want to play this in a combo deck? Am I living tribunaling this? Here's my pitch for what this card actually is. This is a mid-range card. You play this card in your Cersei deck, where all your stuff is like, 5 energy on reveals that you really only care about the on reveal for, right? You play this in your Cersei deck and evolve the card that you just got for 0. You get like an Annihilus and then you turn it into a 6-drop or whatever, right? You play this in your deck with Luke Cage and suddenly you're just playing a card for 0 and Luke Cage is removing the negative power on it. You play this in your, let's say, Iron Man deck, right? Like, you play it in a deck that is not really looking to make sure that the stats on the card are actually all that impactful. My instinct is that this is actually a pretty strong card. I think a lot of people are going to be looking at this the wrong way, and the way they should be looking at it is as Luke Cage makes this card busted, and also you might be able to evolve the thing that you actually put it in. Getting anything for free is pretty crazy. I am generally in favor of getting things for free when I can do that, and this card does allow that to happen. One thing that I do want to talk about with this card, though, is that 4/6 stat line. Because 4/6 is a stat line I think a lot of people think of as like a good stat line, where you have this stat line and things get better. You are able to do a lot of good things with a 4/6 stat line a lot of the time. However, that hasn't been true in a while. We haven't had a 4/6 metagame in a long time, and if you want any proof, go look at Iron Lad. 4/6s are not where things need to be at if there's a little bit of issue about whether or not they're good. This is a card that I wouldn't be surprised to actually see getting a buff at some point, just sort of because of that issue. This is a card, because we talked about how Luke Cage makes it broken. Now we have to talk about how Mobius makes it useless, right? And if Iron Lad is a card that is not really seeing a lot of play, this card reminds me a lot of Iron Lad. And I think if they had to release Iron Lad today, it might have to be a 4/7. And this card might have to be a 4/7 as well, based on that. I'd be really interested to see what they do with this guy, because he is a powerful effect that I think doesn't read very powerful, but if he gets too good, Mobius makes him absolutely nothing. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic to have. It's not my favorite thing, but it is nice that there's a sort of built-in, well, I guess I can't do anything with this guy. I think that's good, right? And I think also that the proliferation of 3/5s has made a 4/6 stat line much less desirable. And I like, it's hard for me to think of the last good deck that is playing 4/6s that isn't Aurashem. Also, this could be an Aurashem card. Let's throw that out there. But yeah, like you play Gwenpool, right? She's not actually a 4/6. She's a 4/12. Like this is a 4/6. The body is a 4/6. It's not actually putting more points on the board. It's gonna get shut down by Mobius in the world where your opponent has Mobius. This is just a 4/6. And so I really wonder about whether or not this card can go up in power. That's sort of where my head is at, because I think that right now it looks pretty strong, but it has this built-in counter such that I don't know if it's ever going to really make it. However, I have been developing a theory that what actually makes people like cards is that they're cool, and this guy might be the coolest looking card we have seen in forever. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it to the end of that video. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I haven't done videos like this in the past and why I feel like I should do them now. So why I haven't done videos in the past, pretty bluntly, is because I've been afraid of being wrong, and I've sort of couched it in these terms where I've talked about like how, oh, it's just clickbait, these cards are going to change, everything's going to be different. But over the last few months, that has become clear to me that I don't think that's true anymore. Um, we've seen these data mines come out, and then the cards come out as that, right? And there was a brief period of time where that was true, right? Like 1-2 Supergiant. Talking about that would have been ridiculous clickbait, right? But for the last few months, by the time stuff gets data mined, it does tend to look pretty much like what it is when it is released. And so without that sort of thing to fall back on, all I was left with was fear of being wrong. Because while that was true at a certain point in time, while it was true that, yes, looking at data mines, looking into the future was a little bit clickbaity because these cards were definitely going to get changed at some point. 1-2 Supergiant is sort of the classic example of that. It hasn't been that true in a while. So that's impetus number one. Impetus number two is once you take that away, all I'm left with is fear of being wrong. And while I think it is reasonable for a public figure to be afraid of being wrong in public, prognosticating on things 4 months out that they have no real knowledge of, yeah, I'm definitely afraid of that. But if that's my only reason not to do something that people want to see from me, I just destroyed the microphone, by the way. If that's my only reason, I don't think it's enough. I know people want this kind of stuff from me. And so this is me dipping my toe in. I'm going to see how it goes. Let me know what you thought about this kind of future card review. I have not really expected to do it, but I do think that as part of like me evolving into being something sort of like a holistic Marvel Snap content creator, it might be an important thing for me to try to do to hone my skills, to do what I can do to make this interesting for both you and for me. Thank you so much for watching it. I really appreciate it. And as always, I have been KM Best and you have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.